We're continuing to follow the breaking news from earlier today. The earthquake happening just off the Northwest California coast. I'm ABC 10 Chief Meteorologist Monica Woods.
And I'm meteorologist Brendan Minchef. That happened just a few minutes before we were preparing to go on air for the 11 a.m. newscast this morning. It was strong at the time. It was 6, and then it was upgraded to 7.3, and then officially became a 7.0 earthquake. Started at or happened at 10:44 Pacific time this morning off the coast of Cape Mendocino. And that earthquake, while it was a ways off the coast, was felt very strongly along the north coast, but it was felt in the upper Sacramento Valley. Even people in Sacramento, in Modesto, felt this earthquake, and obviously, as you might expect, in the coastal range and in the Bay Area as well. Importantly, though, it did prompt a tsunami warning, which lasted a good couple hours.
Right. And as we can take a look at the map, how many of those aftershocks were also being felt and monitored by seismologists at USGS, the U.S. Geological Survey, giving a couple of press conferences, really taking time to make sure that the public knew what was going on, both with a lot of the offshore earthquakes that were happening, but also a couple that were inland as well. And, you know, when those happen, sometimes they get monitored as a much higher magnitude. And they were just trying to make sure that everybody knew what was happening, where there might have been any damage, and what to expect.
Yeah, and it takes time because it's not like a radar where we can kind of see it coming. We have to wait for the initial wave of the earthquake to kind of go around the globe and hit all of the seismometer stations that we have. And that tells us how fast the earthquake is traveling. That tells us the magnitude of the earthquake generally. And it gives us an idea of what to expect in terms of tsunami, no tsunami, whatever it may be. And part of this earthquake, too, that really, I think, sent alarm bells off in my head and so many of the geologists' head was how shallow the earthquake was. It was just 0.6 kilometers below the surface. That equates to about a third of a mile.
Then they did say they're still looking at the depth of the earthquake because that still is going to take a little bit of time to really pinpoint that. But I think what also sent off alarm bells is the Cascadia subduction zone, and looking at that and saying, whoa, this is a really big hotbed for earthquakes where this happened today.
Yeah, this particular location right off the coast. And we've seen a lot of earthquakes there before, but even a 7.0, that's a big one. Maybe not the big one with capital letters, but certainly a very big one.
Some of you may remember 2022, I think it was Ferndale. And so that was the last biggest earthquake in that region. But in that press conference, we can hear from USGS on why this is such a big area for activity in terms of earthquakes.
This is an area in Northern California that's highly tectonically active. And this area is more generally known as the Mendocino Triple Junction. And this is a place where the Cascadia subduction zone, the Mendocino Fault, and the San Andreas Fault all come together. So it's an area where there are at least 3 different tectonic plates that move in different directions and at different speeds. And because of that, earthquakes occur frequently. This earthquake was strong, but it was typical of earthquakes in this area, and it occurred well offshore along the Mendocino Fault. And in this case, we think of this as a right lateral earthquake. So most likely the plate to the north of this earthquake moved to the right, and the plate to the south moved to the left. And because of this strong motion, there was initially concern about tsunamis.
Okay, so that was another big alarm that went off. We had evacuations near Berkeley and inland areas as well. It's very interesting that I don't think people really equate tsunamis so much with California inland areas.
Yeah, but they can certainly happen, and especially along the Bay Area, and especially along the North Coast and the Delta. We're very prone. They're not necessarily common, but they're very prone, should we get one, to some pretty major damage from a tsunami.
And there's been a lot of reaction and change in that warning system. And looking at what happened in 2011 in Santa Cruz, you might be seeing some of those posts and videos of what the Santa Cruz harbor looks like. don't believe it. That is not what
Right.
that is
Yeah.
the 2011 video. So just be aware, social media gets really excited
Yes.
about things like this.
There's a lot of misinformation that goes around out there,
A lot.
especially with AI now. You can generate images, but we did not see a tsunami. It didn't happen. There
Right.
was no tsunami waves. Yes, maybe we saw a rise of a few inches along parts of the coast, but that big destructive wave did not happen.
That tsunami warning ran from right around the California-Oregon border
Yes.
all the way to Santa Cruz. I want to take a look at a map. The California Office of Emergency Services, along with other agencies, including USGS and the early tsunami warning system. We've got it on our map right here. This is the inundation map. So these are the areas that are going to be most vulnerable to a tsunami. You can see it is right on the border there, close to, if we were looking at this and this was, let's say, where the earthquake was today, it was very close to Eureka, right on that point right there near Mendocino. And if you just want to forward there, Brendan, to the next area, what I went ahead and did, look at this. It goes all the way through the Delta. And when we heard that tsunami warning was in the Delta, I think it caught a lot of people off guard because that is not along the coast.
Yes, but we know they're connected. We know that salt water occasionally works its way up into the Delta in quantities that are not healthy, right? We know parts of the Delta are kind of marshy, more of a little mix of, salt and fresh water. But there's a lot of work that goes on to make sure that salt water stays out of the Delta, because generally we don't want that at all. And in the situation like we had today, should we have seen a large and destructive wave work its way into the San Francisco Bay, that salt water and that wave would have continued up through the Delta, and that could have been an exceptionally bad situation.
And we know a lot about this because of our series, California Water Wasted.
Yep.
It is actually on this streaming channel, ABC 10 Plus, but water managers have to work very hard because when you think about it, the Pacific Ocean is always going to win the day.
Yes.
When it comes to the force of that water, the Panama Canal, that water can lift up tons of machinery of a ship, but yet it's so delicate you can swim through it. But when it comes to water coming in from the Pacific, it is always going to win the day in the Delta. Lower level areas, and unfortunately the Delta extremely vulnerable to that. The other kind of illustration, and when we were kind of looking at, okay, how does this make sense? One of the things we pulled up today, and we can go and look at our graphics once again, will show sea level rise. Climate Central doing a great job just kind of looking at the areas most vulnerable. And at one of the top of their lists is the California Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. You can see some of these maps right here. Extreme sea level rise by 2100. How the Pacific Ocean, again, will win the day eventually, inundating much of those small Delta communities. I've got two maps to show you. That one was more towards the Brentwood area. This is more of the smaller islands, as you can see, Discovery Bay there, Victoria Island Road, all of that very vulnerable to certainly sea level rise. But when you have these big ocean occurrences like a tsunami, again, the Pacific's going to win the day, and the Delta becomes extremely vulnerable to that.
Because you can get the salt water, you can get the ocean going the wrong direction. Instead of the Delta serving to drain the fresh water out of the San Joaquin River and out of the Sacramento River and all that water out of the Delta, instead, or out of the Sierra through the Delta, instead it can go the other direction. And that's something that, like you talked about, we have explored a lot with water managers. It's something that the state is very concerned about. I know the Delta Tunnel is highly controversial, and we're not going to go into the pros and cons of that right now. But one of the things that the state always talks about, the Department of Water Resources always talks about when we ask about how do we climate-proof the state? How do we protect California's water supply? Well, they say the tunnel is necessary to protect against earthquakes because it's a lot less likely to collapse a tunnel that's buried underground, which would protect the water supply down to Southern California, but it can also protect against that saltwater intrusion in some instances that we may see from an earthquake or a tsunami. So again, we're not going to talk about the finer details of all of that, but it's certainly something the state is concerned about. They know the Delta is vulnerable to earthquakes and tsunamis.
Right. And so we're just kind of running through the list of questions that people were coming to us with, both in the newsroom and our viewers that were reaching out to us on all of our social platforms, internally with email. The other one that I heard about was, I was in the 1989 Loma Prieta. That one was smaller. This one is huge. I can only imagine the damage. So I was able to get on the press conference with USGS earlier today and ask that very question. Talk about the differences and the similarities between an offshore earthquake and one that originates on landmass. Let's hear from them now.
The things that really affect how much shaking people feel is how far they are from where the earthquake is generated and how deep that earthquake is in the crust. So in this case, the earthquake is not particularly deep. We're still working on a good estimate, but it's on the order of, 10 to 20 kilometers deep, but it's fairly far offshore. So if the earthquake happens farther away, there's less shaking. And in the case of the 1989 earthquake, it occurred underneath the Santa Cruz Mountains in the Bay Area, and the shaking radiated under a lot of urban areas. And a lot of the damage was due to things like weak soils and liquefaction. And so this, because it's farther offshore, farther from populated places, we just don't anticipate the sort of humanitarian effects that we see from these earthquakes that occur under the land.
They really just put everything into perspective,
Yes.
In a very easy to understand way. And it was much appreciated that they reacted so quickly to multiple media agencies reaching out to them, but also answering our questions as well and helping us relay that information to the viewers and users.
Yeah, at the end of the day, with this earthquake and the differences between, one on land, one offshore, it was further away. And I think that's as basic as it gets. If we had this 7.0 in the middle of the San Francisco Bay Area, it'd be a different story.
Right.
If we had it in the middle of San Francisco proper, it would be a different story. The Delta, East Bay, it was just away from the population centers. And you never want a 7.0 earthquake, but this was about as good of a scenario as you could have when a 7.0 occurs. It's offshore. Yes, there was a tsunami warning, but we didn't actually get one forming. So ultimately, places near Eureka, near Ferndale, especially those areas because they had a lot of aftershocks as well, saw some minor damage, things falling off the shelves, but that's about it so far that we've seen. We haven't gotten any reports of any major damage across Northern California.
And you mentioned aftershocks. We saw a lot of that. And we talked a moment ago when we opened this special about the initial assessment that it was a 6.0, jumped up to what, a
7.3, I believe it was at one point.
And brought it back down to a 7.0. One of the aftershocks was registered as a 5.4 by Cobb, I think.
Yeah, it's sort of in the Clear Lake area. It's like North Coast,
And so there was a lot of concern that that's a pretty strong aftershock, right? It was a concern to USGS as well. They look at all of those aftershocks. They continue to assess. They brought that down, and they said, don't be surprised if, there's some fluctuation here. Certainly something to keep an eye on, though.
Yeah, because, again, this isn't something that we can, measure as it's happening. We have to wait for it to occur, whether that's the primary quake or the aftershocks, and you got to wait for those waves to go around the world, and we can measure it in the seismometer with the seismometers. So it's not an exact science. It's something that we start to measure, and then our initial reaction, such as, oh, this is a 5.0 in near Cobb, may not be correct, but ultimately 5.0, if it was, in aftershock would have been slightly concerning.
That would have been very much so. You mentioned waves, and I'll just take an opportunity, shameless promotion here of all of our videos that we've been posting. So many of you sending in your pools.
Yeah, the pool videos.
The seismic waves from underneath, and really that's the easiest way to display kind of what's happening underneath the surface where we can't see it. It really does kind of show you that rolling motion that's happening underneath us.
Yeah, it's like if you had a glass of water in front of you and you kind of grabbed the glass and you shook it back and forth a little bit, that water would move around, maybe splash out of the glass. But if you had like a solid food in front of you or ice cream or something that's, more concrete, it's harder to move. And so especially as you got away from the epicenter of the earthquake into the valley, at that point, really the only things moving was water, the thing that moves very quickly. And some of the harder, ground didn't shake as much.
Right, concerning nonetheless. Other things that we wanted to ask about were aftershocks, just simply because we had that 5.4. Initially, it was moved back down, but I did hear from USGS on what we can expect with the aftershocks.
Right now, as of now, for the next week, we can expect a 6% chance or so for a magnitude 6 or larger. And as you go down to smaller magnitude, like 5 and above, the probability is closer to 40%. So, but the general concept is that earthquakes are expected following a large one, such as a 7, that's a major earthquake. They'll decrease in intensity and what people feel and in frequency over time.
Yeah, so if, essentially recapping, if we were to see another larger aftershock,
Right.
like a 6.0 or something, it kind of resets the clock, because then it's like, was this a pre-shock
Right.
to a bigger earthquake? Or was this the main earthquake and there was a second one, and then maybe we'll see some more aftershocks there? But as far as we know, on fingers crossed,
Right.
the 7.0 that happened at 10:44 this morning was the main event, not the big one with capital letters, but the biggest one that we'll have today.
And I know we've been looking at too, and USGS addressed this, is the tsunami warning that
Yes.
was issued and then said, okay, no tsunami threat. As far as any more tsunami warnings, very unlikely unless we get another big earthquake off the coast.
Yeah.
And each one has to be considered differently. So I think, you know,
Yes.
the immediate reaction is to say, okay, tsunami warning, let's see what happens. So they talked about there's two different ways that these earthquakes can happen. One would be a big vulnerability for tsunamis. The other one, not quite as much.
Yeah, and there's a lot of specifics that go into earthquakes and
Yes.
exactly why some form tsunamis and exactly why some don't. But the basic kind of textbook version goes like this. So we'll take a look at the graphics here. Say you have plate 1 and plate 2 right next to each other, and this is a cross section. So kind of imagine we're standing at the bottom of the ocean and looking off into the distance. So one of the ways you can have an earthquake is plates can kind of slide by each other, right? So an example would look like plate 1 maybe moves backwards and then comes back towards us, right? Moves horizontally. That displaces the water, but it's more like sloshing the water a little bit. It just kind of like maybe pushes the water in one direction and it slides back. It's not really creating big waves with this. There wasn't a lot of displacement of the water.
Right, and I like one of the analogies is if you had a glass of water and you just took a knife and sliced right through it, probably not going to do a whole lot,
Yeah,
right?
We know it would make like a little bit of a wave in the
Yeah.
glass, but it's not going to splash water out of the glass. Now, the more significant scenario would be if we had vertical movement with these plates. Maybe plate 1 rides up onto plate 2, comes back down. That would create a lot of displacement where you're pushing a lot of water up very quickly, and then it comes back down, and that's what creates the big waves that can generate a tsunami. And it's preliminary, right? We don't know exactly what happened below the surface of the ocean earlier today. The USGS said it is likely that it was more of a horizontal movement between plates, where maybe plate 1 and plate 2 were kind of scooting past each other, but we simply don't know. That would be a good guess, considering we actually didn't end up with that tsunami, but you just never know. And so, you know, hopefully this doesn't happen, but if we were to get another 7.0 earthquake, say tomorrow, right in the same spot, and it generates a tsunami warning, we would have to take that one just as seriously as we took it today. We would have to expect there to be a tsunami wave that was generated by that earthquake. We would have to evacuate to higher ground. You just have to take each one of these seriously, because you don't know. We simply do not know exactly which earthquakes will create tsunamis and which ones don't. We have a general idea. This one lit up a lot of alarm bells because it was so shallow and because it was so strong. That kind of immediately tells you, hey, this might or this has a high likelihood of generating a tsunami. Ultimately, it didn't, and that's good news, right? So we got away unscathed. We were lucky with this one, but that may not always be the case, because the next 7.0 earthquake could be one where there's vertical movement and that sends that wave propagating.
And I think that's a good point, too, is that this was something that did not create a whole lot of damage. But given that it is what's called the Mendocino Triple Junction,
Yeah.
it's kind of that meeting ground in between the San Andreas Fault, which is obviously, well, I would say that's probably the most notable one.
It's got
in
a movie
California.
named after it, so I think we're going with that's the most famous.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's going to run kind of south of this area, right through California. North of that is the Cascadia subduction zone. So this is kind of the meeting area that sees a lot of activity. We heard from USGS earlier today. But again, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more action,
Yes.
obviously.
When we've had dozens of aftershocks today alone,
Right.
and many of them were stronger than a 3.0, which is kind of borderline as to whether you feel a 3.0 or not.
Yeah.
But regardless, the seismic activity has been there all day long since this earthquake.
After this tension was
Yes.
kind of released.
Yeah.
I do think it is a wake-up call for all of these different ways that California is preparing us, as well as at the state level, the county level, the city level, the federal level. One of which is going to be the evacuation zones. No evacuation zones. When we were talking about the Delta being vulnerable to the tsunami warning and the just the amount of water that could come through, I thought, I don't know if I would know the evacuation route if I was in that area.
Yeah.
So that certainly was enlightening. The other one is, how many of you got those alerts on your
The
phone
shake
and
alert,
went,
right?
what
Yeah.
is
Yes.
going on here? There's a couple of different ways to get alerted, one of which is to be a part of your county alert system, but there's other ways as well.
Yeah, the most easiest way, take a look at this. The most easiest way would definitely be the Shake Alert app. If we can pull up that graphic real quick. And you'll see that here. Just go to the App Store. No matter what App Store you have, there it is. For instance, this is from my iPhone, so this is the Apple App Store. The My Shake app. You just download it. It's free. You open it, and you just give it your location, and it'll alert you if there is a certain magnitude earthquake in your area. That's it. You set it and forget it, and it just runs. That's what happened today. Meteorologist Rob Carlmark and I were actually sitting in the studio prepping for the 11 a.m., and my phone just starts blaring, and we're like, oh my gosh, what's that? And sure enough, it was a shake alert for that earthquake up in Humboldt. And, you know, maybe 4 or 5 minutes after that, we got the tsunami warning from the Tsunami Warning Center. So that earthquake, the shake alert app, gives you about 30 to 45 seconds heads up in terms of shaking, which doesn't sound like much, but I mean, think back to, you know, the Loma Prieta earthquake. You would rather have 30, 40 seconds, right, versus absolutely no time whatsoever.
Stop, drop, and cover.
Absolutely.
It gives you enough time to do that.
There's one more thing you can do, though. Let's take a look one more time at the graphic, because if you don't download the My Shake Alert, there's one more thing that's already built into your phone. Go to the Settings app on your phone, and then click on, if you have an iPhone, Settings, Notifications, scroll all the way to the bottom, and click on Emergency Alerts. Make sure you have this turned on. It's the top one. It says Emergency Alerts, and it's got a green circle that means it's on. This is not necessarily as local. It can be, but you know, sometimes you'll get some warnings. But here's the thing. This may wake you up in the middle of the night, which is unfortunate, right? But if you need to know, you need to know. If it's connected, if your phone is connected to a cell tower where there's a tsunami warning or a major earthquake, you know, anticipated, your phone will automatically ping you. You don't need the apps. You don't need any apps whatsoever on your phone. You just got to have this turned on. This also applies to something like tornado warnings or other, you know, significant alerts that you need to be notified of. But I just always recommend you turn this on, because even say you're going to Texas to see family and you get a tornado warning for your area, you don't need any extra apps. You'll automatically get pinged via your phone. So I know that these can be annoying in the middle of the night if they wake you up. The My Shake app has woken me up in the middle of the night before for something I didn't need to know about. But it's better to know and be safe than it is to not know and be sorry about it.
Yeah, so in wrapping this up, 7.0 at 10:45 roughly this morning, we had a tsunami warning that was issued and then pulled back. We're going to continue to follow this, obviously, on air at 5, 6, 6:30, online always, and on ABC 10 Plus. For right now, thank you so much. And Brendan, great work today. It has been a day.
Yeah, thanks for watching.